From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't need applause, but our speaker certainly does. And I'd like to welcome you to the Benjamin Botkin Folklife Lecture Series at the American Folklife Center. On behalf of our director, Peggy Bolger, and the entire center staff, we have a special presentation in the Benjamin Botkin Folklife Lecture Series. The series provides a platform to professional folklorists and ethnographers working both in the academy and in the public sector to present findings from their ongoing research. The series allows us to interact with the foremost scholars in folklife and cultural heritage today while building the collections of the library. So this lecture today will be videotaped for our collections, and ask you all now to remember to turn off your cell phones. The Benjamin Botkin Folklife Lecture Series helps the American Folklife Center to fulfill its mandate to present and preserve folklife scholarship. And now you've noticed I've used the word folklife at least 4 times in the last few moments. And it is due to the scholarship and life's work of today's distinguished speaker that our center at the Library of Congress is known as the American Folklife Center. Today I have the honor of introducing Professor Don Yoder, who is an emeritus professor in folklore and folklife and religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And he introduced the term folklife to scholarship in the United States. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and joined the faculty at Penn in 1956, retiring in 1996. So during those 40 years, he founded the first folklife studies program in the United States as part of the folklore department at Penn, which was later renamed the Department of Folklore and Folklife, based on his knowledge of folklife studies movement in Scandinavia and in other parts of Europe. He advocated for an interdisciplinary study of folk culture, including folk agriculture, vernacular architecture, cookery, costume, crafts, folk literature, folk medicine, belief, religious folklife, and customs of the calendar year. Dr. Yoder testified before the United States Senate in 1970 in favor of the establishment of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and from 1976 to 1978, he served on its first board of trustees. At Penn, he was known as an extraordinary teacher, and he directed more than 50 dissertations in 4 academic disciplines. Professor Yoder's publications number in the hundreds, and if I started listing them, then he would never get a chance to speak. So I'm going to just mention that he is a past president of the American Folklore Society and was awarded its Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award in 2006. In the 15 years since his retirement, he has continued to publish and has published more than 6 new books, and one of them is a new edition of Discovering American Folklife, classic text in that field, and also a definitive work, a major work on the Pennsylvania German broadside, a history and guide, and my personal favorite, which is Groundhog Day. I love that book. He's the world's leading scholar on the subject that he will address today, the 2 worlds of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. I hope I deserve it. I'm going to speak very briefly before I show the slides. My topic is the 2 worlds of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And the Pennsylvania Dutch culture is an American hybrid culture. It's a very mixed culture. Ideas were brought from Europe, from Germany, Switzerland, and Alsace, mostly from the Rhineland, which is where the immigrants came from 300 years ago, and into the early 19th century. they settled an area in Pennsylvania which is exactly the size of Switzerland. Pennsylvania is 3 times the size of Switzerland in geographical terms, and the Pennsylvania Dutch country from east into the central part of the state and this lower western part is exactly the size of Switzerland. I think that's extremely important. While the culture is a unified culture in language, we still speak Pennsylvania Dutch. Ich schwätze Deutsch, wann ich muss. I speak Dutch when I must. I learned it as a boy, and my father spoke it perfectly, and he was the 8th generation in Pennsylvania. Anyway, we still have a language of our own, and we brought the Lutheran and Reformed and Mennonite and Amish and Brethren religions to Pennsylvania, and when the Pennsylvania Dutch, who had large families in the 19th century, spread in what I call the Pennsylvania Dutch diaspora into the south, into the North Carolina areas. Western North Carolina has whole counties that have Pennsylvania Dutch families. Canada, in Ontario and New Brunswick, they still talk Pennsylvania Dutch in many parts of Ontario, and especially the Midwest. There are whole counties of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, which were settled by Pennsylvania Dutch immigrants from Pennsylvania in the 19th century, and they brought all of the elaborate and multi-splendored culture that the Pennsylvania Dutch had created here out of building blocks from European ideas. They borrowed ideas from the English Quakers and the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who were the other main settlers of Pennsylvania in the 18th century, and they borrowed things from the American Indians. One of the favorite dishes that I grew up on is mush and milk. I'm sure none of you have ever eaten that. The cornmeal mush, and we borrowed mush and the whole complex of corn culture from the American Indians. We also borrowed things from the blacks who were in Pennsylvania, and very often the blacks in the Pennsylvania Dutch country were the cooks in the little towns, in the hotels, or they were the fiddlers at the country dances. We have many references to that. So I like to stress that the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, which has been developing in America over 300 years now, since 1683, when the first German-speaking settlement in America was founded, the town of Germantown, we have a mixed culture, and which is still developing. The 2 worlds of the Pennsylvania Dutch are the worlds of the so-called church people and the worlds of the plain people. The culture had words for these 2 types of subgroups of their culture. The Kirchenleute, or church people, were the Lutherans and the Reformed, and they came over. They were the products of the Protestant Reformation in Germany and Switzerland in the 16th century, and they form the majority. They form at least 80% of the Pennsylvania Dutch population. They're the church people. And then the plain people, the word for them was die Sektenleute, the sectarians, and that's a sociological term, of course. And these 2 worlds were very different, and you sense it in driving through eastern and central Pennsylvania. You see high-towered churches on the hills, Lutheran and Reformed churches, representing that culture, and you drive to another valley and find simple meeting houses with plain glass windows, and where the Mennonites and so forth operate. It's a very different culture. While they are united in language and customs of the year, the Fraktur art, which has captured the interest of art historians in the whole nation, is used in both of the worlds, the sectarian world as well as the church world. They both created many stunning pieces which are in collections all over the United States and in the world. They also have the same cookery. I'm always amused when I see a new book on Amish cookery or Mennonite cookery. I don't think there is such a thing. There is a Pennsylvania Dutch cookery, which all the groups had. And there, for instance, there are no books on Lutheran cookery or Presbyterian cookery. So I would like to deflate that idea, which unfortunately is growing, that the Amish have a very special type of food practice. They really do not. Anyway, I'm going to illustrate most of this by slides, and I have to say that while the culture is united, it's one culture in language and a lot of things. There's a line down the middle which separates it into two cultures, and that is the line of religion. And these two groups have never been able to agree on anything, the church people and the sectarian people. They often are friends with each other. They're both farmers and small town craftsmen and so forth, but they have never agreed, for instance, even on the keeping of the High German language in Pennsylvania when it was threatened in the 1830s, when the state said we must have English schools in Pennsylvania, we must get rid of German and so forth. There was a movement to petition against this, but the Mennonites and Amish and the Lutherans and Reformed did not unite on this. If they had united, it's possible that Pennsylvania might have created a linguistic enclave in America, something like Quebec in Canada, when High German would still be the language, but that was not to be. High German lasted until the 1940s in the Lutheran and Reformed churches of the two duchious counties of Pennsylvania, Berks and Lehigh. 1948 was the last time when there were regular German services in the country churches of Berks and Lehigh counties. I think that's very important. The two world wars did not kill the use of High German in America. There was some hysteria in the First World War, but most Americans realized that the Pennsylvania Dutch were here by that time for over 200 years, and they were completely American in much of their feeling. I want to say something about the difference between these two groups, religiously speaking. I think the church groups are yay-sayers to the culture, to the world outside. The word world to the plain people means sinful and dangerous and worldly. We have that word worldly in our English language, which suggests that. But the Lutherans and Reformed participated in politics, and they lived as citizens, and they were there following Martin Luther's teaching that the Christian can be both Christian and a full participating member of the state. The plain groups did not always do this. There used to be some plain groups that did not even vote in the national elections, and they were not allowed to hold office. Some of them still have practices like that. So there is a great difference in spirit and acceptance of the world or rejection of the world between these two American Pennsylvania Dutch subgroups. And with that, I will shift to the pictures, if we can turn that hideous light off. Yes. And I mean, who is working the machine? I have this, but I am not a technician.
Well, we have a technician coming, yes.
Yeah, good, we have one.
It might have shut itself off. There we
Yes. If it could be a little darker,
go. Yeah,
I think the light should, you'll see the slides much better. And I took every one of these slides, and I want you to look at them carefully. This is a reminiscence of 1983, a very important year in the history of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. And the Germans were very excited about this, and they published a stamp with this picture of the Concord ship, which was the first ship that brought the 13 Crefeld people. They were mostly Quakers, all Quakers except one family, which was Mennonite, and they came to Philadelphia and went 6 miles north and founded the town of Germantown. And this is, it says, from the Rhine to the Delaware, Crefeld people, Crefelders, found in 1983 Germantown. We owe Pennsylvania Dutch culture. I wonder if this light could be turned out.
I think that we need to keep that.
Oh, all right. We owe all of this, the culture of Pennsylvania, and the Quaker beginnings and the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian contributions and the Pennsylvania Dutch contributions to a remarkable man in the 17th century, one of the religious leaders of Protestantism, William Penn. His dates are 1644 to 1718. I like this picture, which is in an office in Philadelphia. It shows William Penn at the breast of a hill, and behind him are the huddled masses of the English cities, and they're come to America, some of them. And down below, you see the ocean, the ships, and beyond that, a stylized America. And William Penn in 1682 founded, 1681 and 2, founded the state of Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania, which became, I think, the model for the modern multicultural America that we have today. This is the type of setting that the immigrants of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture came from in the 17th century, 18th century. This is the village of Lamsheim. It's in the Palatinate near Worms, and it shows that in the 17th century, security was a local thing. It had a stone wall around it, and there were guards, of course. Security is a national and international thing today, but it was a village thing then. It shows the huddled houses. I used the word huddle there twice. And the church, which was a central aspect of every village. Everyone belonged to the church, the Lutheran or Reformed church, and so forth. And they were farmers very often. They had to keep their cattle with their houses in a very close range, and they had a village cowherd who took the cattle out to the fields every morning and brought them back. It was a new way of life, a way of life which was involved, very, very urban in a way, and yet these people were farmers. When they came to Pennsylvania, they decided to skip the city. They were suspicious of cities by this time, and they had individual farms. This is Pennsylvania, and the black outlined area is what I consider the major portion of the Pennsylvania Dutch country, starting from Easton up above to the right on the Delaware River and going up into central Pennsylvania to my favorite county, Center County, where I have 10,000 cousins in the hills, and down to part of western Pennsylvania. It doesn't include much of Philadelphia or Chester County, although part of that was Pennsylvania Dutch. And this is the area. This is slightly larger than Switzerland, and it wasn't a complete settlement of Pennsylvania Dutch, because some of the counties had little Quaker settlements or little Scotch-Irish settlements, but most of the Scotch-Irish seem to have gotten tired of farming in Pennsylvania and moved to North Carolina and Virginia and so forth, but some of them stayed. This is a typical Pennsylvania Dutch farmhouse, and note the manure pile out front. This is very typical. They brought that idea from Germany and Switzerland. There's a stone house to the right, which was the original house built in the 1770s, and the brick house was built probably in around 1810. This is a Lancaster County farm. Lancaster County is, of course, still a very important agricultural county. One of the differences between the two groups that I'm discussing is that they had a different concept of the ministry. The plain groups choose their ministers by lot. They're very much against higher education, which is suspicious to them. It's too worldly and sinful. And so the Amish, the old order Amish, cut off the possibility of going to school after the age of 14. High school and college are simply vetoed. So they have to pick farmers who have no training in preaching as their ministers. They pick them by lot, using a biblical precedent there, and they have to get along with them. They have to learn how to preach and so forth. They only know the Bible. They have no other religious helps and so forth. But in the church world, we had educated ministers, like the Muhlenberg family, who came over from Hanover in 1742. And the father is up above, and the three sons, he sent them back to Halle, to the university to study, and they all became university graduates and helped the Lutheran Church. So there's a very great difference, and also these people, these educated ministers who had university training, often were scholars. And one of the the Muhlenbergs, the one to the right with the clerical bands around his neck, was Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst Muhlenberg, who was the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania from 1780 to 1815. He was America's greatest botanist at the time, and he corresponded with European botanists and American botanists. And so he was not only a devoted Lutheran minister, but he was a scholar, helping American scholarship. His brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, was a Lutheran minister for a while, but went into politics, much to his father's dislike, and he became the first speaker of the American House of Representatives in Philadelphia when that was the capital in 1789. This is an example of the type of book that the European educated Lutheran and Reformed ministers published. This is The Mirror of the Heart, the Herzenspiegel, and there is a portrait of the minister himself, and so forth. Pennsylvania Germans wrote books like that too in the 18th century. Let's look at the church world now, the Lutheran and Reformed world. This is, strangely enough, a Lutheran church. It's the St. Michael's Church at Strasburg in Lancaster County. In Lancaster County, the countryside was often Mennonite or Amish, plain, that is, and sectarian, but the little towns had Lutheran and Reformed churches. This was a Lutheran church. It's what I call a meeting house church because it doesn't have a tower, and it's kind of in between a Mennonite meeting house or Quaker meeting house and the high-towered Gothic churches of the 19th century. It had plain glass windows, and inside it was very different from churches that succeeded it in the 19th century. This is what the pulpit looked like. It was halfway up the wall, and it faced the people down below and the people in the balcony. And down below there was no altar, as there is in many Lutheran churches now. There was a communion table surrounded by a little fence, and people came to stand at the fence to receive the elements of communion. This is what a Lutheran and Reformed Union church looked like after the Civil War. They added a tower, which they shouldn't have done, but they did that because they felt they didn't ask me, so I didn't give my opinion. And the church, the little building here to the left, is the schoolmaster's house. And one room was the school room, and the rest of the house was for the schoolmaster. And the schoolmaster was a kind of assistant minister, because the Lutheran and Reformed ministers of churches like this often had other churches to deal with and were not here for every Sunday. So I think this picture is rather interesting, and unfortunately that church was torn down in my time. I remember it. It was the churches were always built on hills where they were symbolic of pointing to heaven, and there's now a Howard Johnson's type modern church built there, not on the hill, but down over the hill. Again, they didn't ask me about that. This is the type of church that succeeded the meeting house church in the Lutheran and Reformed world. This is up in the Lycans Valley, where my father's people come from, in Schuylkill and Dauphin County. It was 3 stories. There was a Sunday school room down below. The Sunday school was not part of the colonial church world, and there was always a tower with a bell that rang out over the valley to call the people to church. And there are some churches, Lutheran churches, that look like this, built around 1900, and I think they were trying to build a church that looked like Martin Luther himself. Pardon that. Let's look at the Quaker culture, which preceded the Pennsylvania Dutch culture in Pennsylvania. This was the brochure that I was put out when I was Winter Tour Fellow some years ago, and had a whole day seminar on Quaker culture. This is a Quaker meeting house, built of brick and with two doors, one for the men, one for the women. It was actually, the land was given by an ancestor of mine. It's in York, Pennsylvania. It's the York Meeting House, which is the oldest ecclesiastical structure in the town of York today, older than any of the Pennsylvania Dutch churches. This is a Schwenkfelder meeting house, which was modeled on the Quaker meeting house plan with the two doors and so forth, and the interior is very similar to a Quaker meeting house. The Schwenkfelders were a group of religious people, Protestants, who were driven out of Silesia, which is now partly in Poland, in the 1720s, and they fled to Germany and came to Pennsylvania, where there are the only living Schwenkfelder churches in the world. I like this picture. It's a canal boat picture by an artist showing two Quaker women there who stand out very distinctly from the very worldly women back of them, on the bench back of them. The Quaker costume was identifiable everywhere. This is one of the things it made. The Quakers have three testimonies. One is equality, and when you dress alike, you're expressing equality silently. And one is peace, the testimony of peace, and so forth. This is a Quaker named Rebecca Lukens, Rebecca Pennock Lukens. The Pennocks came from Ireland. They were Irish, Anglo-Irish Quakers, and very important in Pennsylvania. And Rebecca married a man named Lukens, one of the Germantown Quaker names, and he was the founder of the Lukens Steel Mill at Coatesville, Pennsylvania. He died rather young, unfortunately, and Rebecca had to take over the business, and she ran the steel mill, and she looks like she could run a steel mill. She was a Hicksite, a liberal Quaker, and this is the costume that she wore. This is a curious daguerreotype that I found one time at a flea market. It's obviously a Pennsylvania Dutch young woman, and of one of the plain sects, and I think it's the Old Order River Brethren who have a curious cape like that extends far over the shoulders, but I have no way of knowing whether that is true. But it's a very beautiful picture. They weren't supposed to have their pictures made. The Amish especially are against photography. They call them graven images, and these are in the Ten Commandments that they mustn't have them. This is a picture that came out in around 1900 of two plain girls, milkmaids, carrying milk from the barn, I guess, and showing the beauty of the plain costume. They did create a life of simplicity. The Quakers, they borrowed the word plain and the idea of simplicity from the Quakers, and the Quakers borrowed it from the Puritans. As time went on, the plain groups began to modernize. And I like this photograph. I have a whole collection of plain photographs that should be published sometime in a book. But this shows the grandmother, who is still plain, Mennonite, with a long dress and an apron. They always wore a fancy, not a fancy, but a parade apron, a Parade Schürze in German. And she's wearing the white cap, which is the married women's cap. But her daughter is dressed in Victorian or Edwardian costume, and the child certainly is dressed in a modern way. I think that is a very revealing picture. When I went to teach at F&M in the 1940s, some of the department stores still had plain clothes departments. And this is when I collected all the information I could on this, because I was working on the costume history of the Pennsylvania Dutch people, and this is very interesting. They these are the men's costumes, very plain and so forth. A strict Mennonite won't wear a tie, and I interviewed an old Mennonite woman on why that was, and she said a tie is neither for hot nor cold. It won't make you warm in the winter, it won't make you cool in the summer, so why wear it? The plain groups have a lot of distinctive religious customs, and this is the one of washing the saints' feet. And if you noticed, at Easter time they always show the Pope washing the feet of seminarians or something, and it is in the Gospel of John that at the Last Supper, before the Last Supper or afterwards, they washed the saints' feet. Jesus did it as a sign of humility. And this is a famous picture from about 1900 from an American family magazine showing the Church of the Brethren people washing the saints' feet. This is a very curious costume that the smallest Mennonite group in Lancaster County wears. They're called the New Mennonites. They were new in 1810 or 12 when they were founded, and they have a very distinctive bonnet, and all elements of the costume have to be the same color. I think that's rather interesting. They also are known as the Hurrites, H-E-R-R-I-T-E-S, from their founder, Francis Hur. This is the Mennonite Martyr Book. They did produce some literature, and it's called The Bloody Theater, Der blutige Schauplatz oder Märtyrerspiegel, or Mirror of the Martyrs. And this was published in Holland Dutch in 1660 and 1685, 2 editions, and the Mennonites wanted it in Pennsylvania in the 1740s because they saw the war clouds in Europe, and they thought perhaps they would be subject to persecution over here as they were so much in Europe. And so they took the project to the Ephrata cloister, and Peter Miller, one of the founders, one of the leaders of the cloister, translated this from the Holland Dutch into very good High German. And it was published, it was the largest book published in the colonial period on any American press. It was published at Ephrata in Lancaster County by the Cloister Brethren, 1748 and 49. It's a very beautiful title page. Now let's look at the Amish a bit. The Amish have their own peculiar costume, and they all, these girls are wearing aprons. These may be work aprons, but when they go to meeting, they wear a show apron, of course, or an apron, a dress apron, I would say, over their dress. This is a group of Amishmen. The Amish have services, the old order, they meet in farmhouses. They never were allowed to build meeting houses in Europe, and so they continued that practice in Pennsylvania. They meet every other Sunday, and this is what the men do between the services. When they have a service, after they eat the meals, the men are always served first. It's a patriarchal system, unfortunately, and the children are last, and so forth. And this shows the men out front of the house during between the services. And note that everything is whitewashed. Whitewash was a great blessing in early Pennsylvania. They even they whitewashed the trees out in the yards. This is the most unusual Amish costume in America. It's a group from the Big Valley, or Kishokaquillis Valley, up in Mifflin County near Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, Lewistown, Pennsylvania, and strangely enough, they're called the Nebraska Amish. They may have moved to Nebraska and then moved back. And they still wear the flat hat of the 18th century. If you know anything about 18th century prints, you know that the women wore a flat hat, sometimes having it flat on their head, and sometimes, as this woman did, tying it under the chin. It was succeeded by the bonnet in the 1790s. A Quaker woman brought the new fashionable plain bonnet to Pennsylvania, Martha Ruth, and this was copied by the Mennonites and the Amish later on. The Amish have the oldest hymnal in the United States, in the world. It's called the Ausbund, the binding up of chapbooks. And the earliest edition was 1564. It was not originally Amish because the Amish didn't develop until the 1690s, and this was the Mennonite hymnal, which all the Mennonites used in Pennsylvania until 1803 and 1804, when they decided they wanted American hymnals and published them. But the Amish inherited this, and they still sing 12 or 14 hymns from it, and they sing like Gregorian chanting, a very curious way. And the Library of Congress published a record on red vinyl at one time of the Amish singing, and it's still, I believe, available. The Amish also do some other things which the Mennonites do not do. They still allow dancing at weddings. And this is a picture of that I value very highly. It's a wedding dance in Canton-Bern, Switzerland. And if you know anything about the Amish, they have all Swiss names, and all but one or two come from Canton-Bern, Switzerland. This is not an Amishman, but he certainly could be an Amishman with a beard and a brown coat, a plain coat, but the young people are dancing, they're celebrating the wedding. And this is what the Amish do even today. They have a wedding dance or wedding dances. The Amish also do something very interesting. When the youngest son, they have big families, when the youngest son gets married, he inherits the farm. And this comes from the laws of Canton-Bern, Switzerland. And the laws of Canton-Bern, Switzerland said when that happens in a family, you have to build a house for the parents. And so here is an example of a house which in 1852 was given to the youngest son, and the parents moved to this little house to the right. And this, by the way, is an ancestral house of mine, a Gingrich farm, and I only mention my Gingrich connection to close friends. For obvious reasons. The Moravians were also a sectarian group, but they're kind of in between the plain groups and the church groups. They had more churchliness than some of the plain groups, and this is one of the buildings at historic Bethlehem. And there's the southern place where the Moravians have their archives is Salem, Old Salem in North Carolina, now part of the city of Winston-Salem. But I don't like to mention Winston because of the cigarette business. This is a Moravian woman, Elizabeth Baylor, the wife of Peter Baylor, who came to Pennsylvania. And he's very important in the history of religion because he was on the ship that went to Georgia, taking Moravians there in 1736 when John Wesley was aboard. And John Wesley was the great founder of the Methodist Church, which by 1840 was the largest Protestant church in the United States and still is extremely important. And John Wesley talked with Peter Baylor on shipboard, and he decided to learn German. He went to Herrnhut to study the Moravians, and he was influenced by them. He almost joined the Moravians in the 1740s, but he decided to stay in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and he founded the Methodist group within the Anglican fold. I was interested in costume, the fact that the plain groups wear a white cap, which in peasant culture in Europe was a symbol of the married woman. The children did not always wear the cap, and I found one time when I was sailing up and down the Rhine or the Moselle, I forget which, I saw these two women with white caps on, and here they are deaconesses in the Protestant Church of Germany. And this was a 19th century movement, and it was an attempt to give women who want to devote their lives full-time to the church by not marrying a way of doing this in the Protestant world, such as nuns do in the Catholic world. And there are several deaconess costumes that I worked on at the time that are extremely interesting because of their similarity to Pennsylvania's plain costumes. These are Pennsylvania plain people, and they were members of a group called the United Christian Church, which is a very small group in Lancaster and Lebanon counties, They were singers of my bush meeting songs. I did a book called Pennsylvania Spirituals, and they came to our festival one time and sang for us, and here they're posing for me holding my book. I was very moved. Now, you have to hold on to your chairs because the next slide is somewhat shocking. It shows why there are plain Quakers and plain Mennonites, why they wanted to get away from costume. And there she is, the Duchess of Kent in 1618. And there was a class system in England until the 20th century, I guess, or 21st. And people like this had the money. They ruled the estates, they ruled the peasants, and they dressed like this. And the Puritans got tired of it. And in the 17th century, George Fox and the Quakers got tired of it. And they dressed plain. They had the testimony of simplicity. So goodbye, Duchess of Kent. This is a picture that I like. It's by a Russian artist around 1811 of a tavern dance. And I don't know whether is the fiddler, I think the fiddler was a black man, I mentioned that. And here the Conestoga wagon, a product of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, is outstanding outside the door. And the wagoners are dancing with the local girls and so forth. Dancing was extremely important in Pennsylvania. There were tavern dances and Fastnacht dances and so forth. The Lutherans and Reformed also had style even in their tombstones, and this is a very interesting tombstone with a kind of Baroque scroll up at the top. They were aware of the artistic trends in Europe, and this even affected their tombstones. The Mennonites and Amish do not do this. They have very plain tombstones without any decoration or without very much. This is one of my favorite Lutheran and Reformed tombstones. It's the tombstone of a maiden lady, as we used to say, Maria Fisher. It's in the Ole Valley Cemetery, and it shows the shield down below, the pillars, the neoclassical pillars, and of course the symbol of muted mourning, the weeping willow, which took over on tombstone art about the 1850s. But this is an extremely beautiful stone, and there are thousands of these waiting to be studied in the cemeteries of eastern Pennsylvania. This is the crudest and the oldest Pennsylvania German tombstone. It's at the St. Gabriel's Church at Douglasville, and it's dated 1719. And it has the skull and crossbones and the hourglass, which is turned sideways, suggesting that the life is over. The Pennsylvania Dutch didn't begin quilting in Europe. It's an English and Welsh habit in America, but they certainly became master quilters. And this is simply a picture to introduce that subject. The Amish quilts. The Amish are not a creative culture. They borrowed almost everything that they practice in their culture from the larger Lutheran and Reformed church culture. But in quilting, the Amish women who stayed at home and didn't often get out into the public like the Amish men created something very distinctive, the Amish quilt. And they used dissident colors like purples and greens together. This isn't exactly the one that I was hoping to show you, but this is an Amish quilt with a purple border, and they created something extremely important in the Amish quilt. And when I was in Zurich a few years ago, I've been there many times, but one time I saw an art gallery full of Amish quilts. And they are so popular now in the world of antiques that the Amish have hired some of the Hmong refugees from Southeast Asia to make them to sell. Food, of course, is another angle where there is a united culture among the plain groups and the church groups. This is a rather famous book called Sauerkraut Yankees. This is what the soldiers were called in Virginia and North Carolina when the Union Army got south in the Civil War, those sauerkraut Yankees. Scrapple is a Pennsylvania Dutch gift, whether you like it or not. It was really Panhaus. I was once very greatly surprised and delighted. I was at the University of Münster in the Rhineland in Westphalia studying, and I went to a restaurant for lunch, and they had Panhaus on the menu, and I ordered it. It was almost black because they still put blood in it, which the Pennsylvanians gave up. And it was a half inch thick, and it was served on a piece of toast. I had never eaten it like that, but I welcomed seeing the word Panhaus, which I've known all my life. But scrapple is the English word, and I think William Boyce Weaver, the most important food historian of the Pennsylvania Dutch, says that scrapple came to America via Germantown because they were North Germans, North Rhinelanders, and they don't even know it in the Palatinate, where perhaps the majority of the Pennsylvania Dutch people came from. They don't know it in Switzerland. Also, rye whiskey is the Pennsylvania form of whiskey, and this is Old Overholt. It was made by a Mennonite named Abraham Overholt from Lancaster County, who moved west near Pittsburgh. And the Mennonites today are all temperance people, and they would like to forget Abraham and his rye whiskey and rewrite history, but they're not able to do that. Also, Pennsylvania, despite the fact that we have more farmers markets with fresh food than any other state, according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, we also make a lot of junk food. And this is my favorite one. I don't eat it, but I love the title, Nibble with Gibble. The hex signs are now being called barn stars, and perhaps that's a better term because they really had nothing to do with hexerai or witchcraft when they were put on the barns in Pennsylvania. The symbols, the geometrical symbols, were important in the culture in Europe. They put them on houses, but the Pennsylvania Dutch used these symbols on fraktur, on tombstones, everywhere. And finally, someone had the brilliant idea of taking a carpenter's compass and making them very large on the forebay, the public side of a barn. They are beautiful, and they have been studied. In fact, I wrote a book on hex signs, but I'm using the term barn stars now. The furniture that the Pennsylvania Dutch made was distinctive, and this is the famous Huber schrank. A schrank is a wardrobe. It shouldn't be called a kas, which is the Holland Dutch word. Antique dealers often make that mistake. This should be called a schrank, S-C-H-R-A-N-K. And it's dated 1779 for Georg Huber, George Huber of Lancaster County, and it's a perfect, magnificent piece. It has the whirling swastikas, which were common symbols, had nothing to do with Hitler's stiff-legged swastika at all. It was used on fraktur and tombstones and so forth. It has the cross and the crown, the penalty of life and the reward of life, and so forth. A lot of symbolism here. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I must say that at the Winter Tour Museum at the present time, there is the finest exhibit on Pennsylvania furniture, not only the Pennsylvania Dutch furniture, but the Quaker and other furniture of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And they published a magnificent book by Wendy Cooper and Lisa Minardi, which you should be aware of. These are some people that I photographed at the Kutztown Festival. I was one of the 3 academic founders of this with Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Fry in 1950, and in 10 years it became the largest festival in the United States. And it was a folklife festival from the very beginning. We tried to put on display elements of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture which you can't put on display in a museum. And you can talk to craftsmen, for instance, who are working at their benches. You can talk to the cooks who are making the Dutch food. And these were 3 women whom I got to know at the festival, dressed in Dutch costume. The sunbonnets are quite accurate. Every woman wore a sunbonnet when she went out to work in the garden. They didn't have the cult of tanning that we have today, even though it's dangerous. And the woman in the middle had a kind of Victorian bent with her little cap, a hat, and so forth. Anyway, most of the folk festivals before Kutztown were music and dance festivals, where you had a stage and an audience and performance. There were performance venues, and we tried to put the Dutch culture on display, as I said, for a week at a time, and it's still going after 61 years. It's just amazing. There's another very important person, Mabel Schneider from near Reading. She worked 50 weeks of the year in a shirt factory at Reading, and she took 2 weeks vacation and always took 1 week to stand out in the hot sun and make soap, to demonstrate how the Pennsylvania Dutch farm wives made soap out of lye and ashes. And her sunbonnet is very interesting. She gave me one as a museum piece, really it is. It's called a boppedekel hoed. In Pennsylvania Dutch, the word boppedekel means cardboard, because the strips that stiffen the brim of the hat, of the cap, of the bonnet are made of cardboard. You take them out when you wash the fabric. So she made this, of course, and made one for me. I don't wear it, but she gave it to me. Mabel Snyder, I honor her. Note the modern glasses too. I think they go very well with the with the old-fashioned dress and the sunbonnet. This is Clarence Culp. He represented the Church of the Brethren tradition. He was a descendant of Christopher Sauer, the printer, and he had only a high school education. He knew High German. He had studied Holland Dutch. He could read the Martyr book in Holland Dutch, and he knew Pennsylvania Dutch perfectly. He had an almost photographic memory for the songs that were sung in the Brethren Church and the Mennonite Church when he was growing up. And he became a plain Brethren person. He grew a beard, but not a mustache. The mustache is a no-no for the plain groups because it was a military symbol in the 17th century. Soldiers had them, but he wore a beard. And Clarence Culp has written a great deal. He's no longer living, unfortunately, but he represents the self-taught scholar that you have in the plain groups, in the Mennonite and even in the Amish groups, where they can't go to college and get a full education. They yet devote themselves to scholarship in a very wonderful way, and he certainly did. Clarence Culp. And this is Professor Schnitzel. He was a baggy pants comedian who published records. He came to the festival every year, and he would begin his spiel by saying, "I'm so glad to see so many of you here today, even from foreign countries like New Jersey." And everyone, of course, would laugh at that. He was a gifted Dutchified English speaker, and that's one of the languages that the Pennsylvania Dutch have, Dutchified English. This is another woman that came. I never got her name, but she's eating a piece of shoofly pie, and she liked to dress up in kind of semi-Victorian or Edwardian style and swish around at the festivals. Pennsylvania, because of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, because the crafts lived into the 20th century, has become, I think, the center and motivation for the modern American craft movement, the do-it-yourself movement. This is a dear friend of mine, no longer living, Ollie Strausser, the basket maker. And this shows him using the materials that he made his wonderful baskets from. So he kept the basket making practice alive into the 20th century. This is another old friend of mine, Milton Hill, who was a wagon maker. You have to make wheels, and that's the main thing, but he could make a whole wagon. And this, of course, was a very detailed rural craft which was brought from Europe. When we think that these ancestors who came over on the crowded ships in the 18th century, what they brought in their minds and hearts, and also in the gifts of their hands. This is one of the hand gifts, the craft gifts of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And now I have 4 more slides. I hope you can sit through them. I want to prove now that I'm Pennsylvania Dutch, as if I have to. This is the church in the Higgins Valley or Likens Valley in Pennsylvania, north of Harrisburg. It was built in 1874, and every brick, it's a Lutheran and Reformed Union church. They had one church and alternated services, and every brick that makes up that church was made on my grandfather Yoder's farm. He gave the clay, the good clay along the Pine Creek where his farm was, and he gave the congregation the right to dig the clay and make the brick. So this, and my father was baptized in that church on the Lutheran side in 1883. So this is very close to me, and there used to be 900 or 1,000 of these union churches, Gemeinschaftliche Kirchen, in Pennsylvania between the Lutherans and Reformed. It was a grassroots ecumenical movement. Unfortunately, today they're breaking up the churches, and you have 2 churches instead of 1. And they used to say, there is a joke that is told, that in the 20th century, when the Lutherans and Reformed began to fight in these congregations, as they sometimes do, church people, they fought over the heating of the church. And it was too hot for the Reformed or too cold for them. And so they decided to have 2 furnaces, a Lutheran furnace and a Reformed furnace. I hope that joke is true. But you can quote me on it if you want to. This picture is very important to me. It's my great-great-grandmother, Magdalena Maurer, and she's dressed for church. She has her silk apron on and the silk shawl. She has a black cap, not a white cap like the Mennonites. She was a Lutheran, and her maiden name was Klutz. And I once made the mistake at a genealogical conference. We were at lunch after the lectures, and we were going around the table and saying what family we were really working on. And one person said, I'm a Balliot, I'm a Wesco, I'm a Helfrich. And when it came to me, and I said, and I'm a Klutz. And everyone laughed because I'm obviously not a Klutz. Anyway, this picture is a good one. She was born in 1783 and died in 1876, and I talked to people, my aunts who knew her as little girls. This was their great-grandmother. And my grandmother looked just like her. My grandmother was her granddaughter. This is the first car that chugged into the town of Higgins and in the valley. This was our farm. The yard outside the house, and it was my uncle's car, and his wife, who's seated at the driver's seat, although she couldn't drive, she's posing. It was my Aunt Luella, my father's youngest sister, and the other occupants of the high-back car are my other aunts. I think the picture is good, and it shows the value of collecting historic photographs like this. And finally, this is my favorite picture of all these. This is my grandmother, the old woman seated in the rocking chair with the long black dress. My Aunt Emma Yoder to the left, whose memory was so great, and she taught me so much about the meaning of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. And the other 2 are my Aunt Ida and Aunt Elvina. This was taken in 1918. My oldest cousin, Aunt Ida's son, Albert, was in the army in France, and so they had the flag up. So this is my family. My father owned that farm for 10 years when I was a boy, and I grew up with the Pennsylvania Dutch and so forth. So I hope you will admit that I am Pennsylvania Dutch. I did bring along today Dale Phillips, who is a legitimate Pennsylvania Dutchman too. And I wanted to say, if you just have a minute or 2, what a pleasure it is for me to speak at the American Folklife Center. As my introducer said, I did help to bring it into being in 1976, I think it was, and it is a going concern, and I gave my collection of religious hymnody, the camp meeting songs, and my witchcraft and powwowing tapes to them. Some of them were wire recorders. I told someone today I was once mistaken carrying a heavy, almost too heavy to carry, wire recorder into a farmhouse. I was mistaken for a Jehovah's Witness minister. but it didn't take long to assure them that I wasn't. Anyway, I'm very proud to have been connected with the early years of the center and the great years when people like Wayland Hand were involved, and he and I did the conference on American folk custom here in some years ago, and it's great to see Alan Javour here, my old colleague and friend, and all of you whom I have known in the past. So thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
Dr. Yoder has time for a few questions, if there's some. You've stunned them. Question?
Dr. Yoder, I some years ago came across a volume of Anne Hark's stories, and I now have 2 of her volumes and her cookbook with Preston Barba. And she disappeared without a trace, and I've Googled and Googled and found very little evidence. Did you know her? Do you know whatever became of her?
I knew her, yes. She was a Moravian. Her father was J. Max Hark, who was at Bethlehem. And she was one of the persons who focused the tourists on the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. She wrote these books, Blue Hills and Shoofly Pie, and so forth. And she wrote children's books, but she seemed to have taken the idea of the famous room in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the House of the Miller at Millbach. She used that and applied it. Her people were Amish. She has a lot of mistakes. And she also, it's come out recently that she was never married, and she went around with a chauffeur to the Dutch country and went to farms. And she must have been very suspect in the Mennonite farms where they served her supper with her chauffeur. Anyway, she did a lot especially for Pennsylvania Dutch tourism. But a person who did much more was Cornelius Wygant, who was my predecessor at the University of Pennsylvania. He was in the English department, and he wrote a famous book in 1929, The Red Hills, all about the Pennsylvania Dutch country. They're charming essays that he wrote as a very talented English professor. And then he wrote The Blue Hills, The Dutch Country, and other books. And he helped to create both the antique interest in the Pennsylvania Dutch material culture, but also the tourists coming to Pennsylvania to see the Pennsylvania Dutch. And Lancaster County has become one of the main tourist areas of the United States. They say that 5 or 6 million tourists come to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania alone every year just to see the Amish. Yes.
Do you agree with John J. Stout on his views of the barn stars and the symbolism?
Well, the John Joseph Stout, who was a cousin of mine, not a first cousin, but a definite relative, whom I knew very well, was a good scholar. He was excellent in religion. He was trained in religion, and he had the idea that that there was symbolic meaning in a great many of the fraktur designs, and he had a rather wild system that took it back to medieval Catholic mysticism, to the age of the lily and so forth. And I think much of his extreme symbolism has been toned down. People did not really buy that, and I don't buy it either. But I do like many of his books. John Joseph Stout, yes.
You briefly referred to the word plain and how it had come to be applied to the Pennsylvania Dutch. But
Plain?
I gather that is to the sect people.
Yes.
Do they accept that term, plain?
Yes,
or-
they certainly do.
So it's
They certainly do. It comes from the Puritans in England, who are at the background of the Quakers. The Quakers came out of the Puritan movement, in the 17th century, and they used the word plain. You went plain, you dressed plain, and so forth. And the Puritans had preceded them in that use, and the Pennsylvania Dutch used that. But the Amish, I don't know whether I should mention this, but the Amish have another word, and that is the opposite of plain is gay. And this is the religious word gay. It's not the meaning of gay that we have today that's in the foreground, but this is the Puritan word, and the Quakers used it, and the Amish used it, at least until very recently. They say when one of their sons left the Amish fold, he went gay. He went into the world. And Dr. Shoemaker and I, who were the leaders of the Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival, were working on what to call the plain Dutch and the church Dutch, and we hit on the term gay Dutch. And this was right before the word began to shift in its emphasis into what it is presently. And some people are still using this, but some stupid people changed gay Dutch to fancy Dutch. And that is ridiculous. There's nothing like a fancy Dutchman, I'm sure. But the word plain is a very important word, and I think that I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes?
Hi. I had a follow-up question on that. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, you mentioned that it came from the Quakers. The Quakers, by the 20th century, had discarded the level of the costume and the sectarianness that the plain sects of the Germans continued. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why they continue to do that even now.
Yeah. Okay. The Quakers, yes, there are very few plain Quakers today. There are a few in North Carolina and a few conservative Quakers who dress plain in Ohio and so forth. But the Philadelphia Quakers and the Earlham Quakers and so forth dress like other Americans, just like the Lutherans and Reformed. They're not plain anymore. And I think the Quakers in the 20th century, when they began to give up the plain costume, they realized that plain costume is outward. It's an outward symbol. It was important at one time to preach equality and simplicity by wearing a plain costume, all the women dressing alike, the men dressing alike. But they were more important in the world, their world, the moral questions of the world, the wars and so forth, and they decided to give up the plain costume, which was only an outward symbol, and concentrate on the inward things, which were more important to them. I think that's true. But the plain groups, so-called plain groups, the Amish and Mennonites, they still feel that it's important to have this outward symbol of everyone being alike. Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the Union churches.
Yes.
How did that movement begin? Was that because the Reformed and the Lutherans originated from the same area in Europe, and so when they went there, that they just maintained that unity? Is that how that happened?
No, it's an American thing. These people settled together in valleys and had a valley community, and they founded a church, and some of them were Lutheran, some of them were Reformed. Sometimes a Lutheran man would marry a Reformed woman and so forth. Most of the people were mixed in that way, and so they decided to have union churches. There was in the Rhineland, in the 17th century, after the elector of the Palatinate in 1685 became Catholic, he insisted on having the Reformed Church shared by the Catholics. And so there are some examples of these churches, a famous one at Otterberg near Kaiserslautern, beautiful church built by the Cistercians. It was a Reformed church until 1700 or so, and the Catholics built a wall separating the choir from the nave. And the Catholics they were smaller in number. They took the choir, and the Reformed took the nave. And I had the great joy of seeing that wall come down. And now they worship together. They have a Catholic service early in the morning, and then they have the Reformed service. Yes. Was there a question here before one more?
Well, I was going to ask a question, Dr. Yoder. You mentioned that the Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival was among the first to do a different venue besides music.
Yes.
Was that a result of any of your experience with European folk museums or
You know, both Dr. Shoemaker and I were aware of what was going on in Europe, and it's simply a matter of we became interested in broadening folklore into folk life. And as the way it had been done in Scandinavia, Dr. Shoemaker brought the term folk life from Scandinavia, folkliv, and that was translated from Volksleben, the German word folk life, which was a much earlier term. And it was true that these people were looking at every aspect of traditional culture. Three that I became very interested in that most folklorists didn't deal with: food history, costume, and medicine, folk medicine. Well, Wayland Hand was, of course, a master in folk medicine, but most folklorists had a rather limited view of what folklore should include. It was mostly verbal culture, and folk songs, folk tales, riddles, folk speech, and things like that. And material culture was out, and they had no way of, they divided everything into genres, in my opinion, and they had no way of treating religion. They had a genre called superstition, and I never could agree with dear Wayland Hand, a wonderful friend of mine, who continued to use the word superstition. I think it's a wrong, unscientific word. So we tried, beginning at Kutztown and so forth, to broaden the American concept of folklore into folk life. And that's why I'm so glad that there is an American Folk Life Center at the Library of Congress, and there's a folk life program at the Smithsonian Institution, and there are folk life programs in New Hampshire, that wonderful one that has published the whole series of documentary books on folk life materials, and there are folk life offices in some of the states in the public sector. So I'm very happy that this is happening. I think we have to be as broad as possible in looking at the culture that our ancestors had and how it came down to us. Yes.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.